Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. The Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. Now, back in January of this year, much of the world was transfixed by the images of destruction coming from LA fires. Horrific, horrific images. However, as often is the case in natural disasters, much of the world has since moved on. Yet there are some people who have not moved on, but dug in. And there are especially people who have dug in to promote healing, restoration, and justice. And I'm especially encouraged when the people who have dug in are followers of Jesus. And that's why I'm so excited to have as my guest today, Jasmin Shupper. Jasmin is the founder and CEO of Greenline Housing Foundation, a nonprofit aiming to close the racial wealth and home ownership gap and reverse the effects of systematic racism by increasing access for Black and Brown communities. Jasmin, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks, Curtis. Thank you so much for having me. That was such a wonderful introduction.
I think many people view the LA fires as simply a natural disaster and are not aware of the ways in which racial justice, racial disparity are actually dynamics as part of the fires. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you touching on that, because while we know that natural disasters do not discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity and class, what we do know is that there is often a disproportionate impact in the rebuilding, specifically as it pertains to communities of color. And that is because of this legacy of systemic inequities. And that's something that is present in national disasters across the board.
Well, explain how that happened in LA, in the LA fires. Which neighborhood was especially affected, and that shows some of these racial dynamics?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we had the Palisade Fire and we also had the Eaton Fire. Now, the Eaton Fire is the disaster that Greenline is responding most closely and specifically to. And I will also say that it's close to home for me in a number of ways. We live in Eaton Canyon, the canyon that caught fire. And miraculously, and by the grace of God, is what I tell people, our house is still standing. But we had to evacuate multiple times that same night. And so we're feeling and dealing with the effects of that displacement. We're still not back in our home. And so we're living this alongside with the community. And so what we're responding to in the Eaton Fire specifically, and kind of how it came to be in the Eaton Fire, is that you've got a population in Altadena, which is where the majority of the Eaton Fire burned, was Altadena. And it's a beautiful and vibrant and really unique and special community, partly because of how diverse it is, and not just ethnically, but also socioeconomically diverse, diversity of thought. It's a thriving community where neighbors love each other and they work together and everybody knows who their neighbor is. And one thing that's particularly interesting about Altadena is that it had a Black home ownership rate that was almost double the national average. That's because historically, Altadena presented fewer barriers to access home ownership for Black and Brown people than surrounding areas, even its neighbor to the south in Pasadena. Pasadena had a legacy of racially restrictive covenants and housing discrimination. At one point in Pasadena, 60% of the homes had racially restrictive covenants attached to them. Altadena was not like that in Altadena. And that's not to say that Altadena was the land of milk and honey by any means, because Black people still faced opposition, they faced discrimination, they faced barriers, but those barriers were less in Altadena than they were in other areas. And that's why you see this gift of proximity with different people who look differently or think differently living together in proximity, and all the beauty that you get from that. Conversely, because Altadena still had redlining, what you had was a concentration of a lot of communities of color and people of color in West Altadena, because in East Altadena, where the lots were a little bit bigger and the houses were a little bit bigger, Black people couldn't purchase there. Redlining was very prevalent there. So they were able to access opportunity in West Altadena. So you had a significant demographic of Black people in West Altadena. Well, what we know about natural disasters, like I said, and their disproportionate impact on communities of color, even though Altadena Black people in Altadena made up 8% of the population. They made up almost 50% of the people who lost their homes in Altadena. And of that, 57% of those were people 65 and older who had generational homes that had been in the community forever. And so that's kind of highlighting that disproportionate impact in the community.
Jasmin, I don't think everybody may understand exactly what you mean by those terms, redlining and racially restrictive covenants. Can you explain a little more how they worked and just how prevalent they were, not just in LA, but across the country?
That's right. Yeah. And I'd be happy to unpack them a little bit. So, racially restrictive covenants and redlining were two of the tools used to perpetuate housing discrimination and to segregate communities. They were by no means the only tools, right? But they were some of the more prevalent tools used to segregate neighborhoods to prevent integration of neighborhoods. And redlining is the practice by which banks refuse to lend or insurers refuse to provide insurance to people, and they assess risk based on the ethnic makeup of the community. So diverse communities, Black communities, Hispanic communities are deemed to have a higher risk or red rating, which is where the term redlining came from. And they were identified as don't invest there, specifically because of the ethnic makeup, not because of people's financial aptitude or ability to pay loans, specifically based on the ethnic makeup. So that's redlining. And it was a really effective tool in segregating neighborhoods. Then you also have racially restrictive covenants, which was another tool that basically was a clause attached to deeds that said that this property shall not be sold or transferred to anyone that is not of the Caucasian race. Again, another tool used to perpetuate housing discrimination and keep neighborhoods separate. This happened in communities across the country. There were a number of things that led to segregation of neighborhoods, a lot of legislation that was happening federally that was then being manifested and implemented locally and municipally. And so, yeah, those are just kind of some of the tools. We also had, I don't want to make this too much of a history lesson, Curtis, but it's significant because the history informs present day realities, which informs why we have the disproportionate impact that we see. So it's really important that people consider these all together and not as isolated incidences, if that makes sense.
Yeah, when I remember first discovering the history of redlining and racially restrictive covenants in the book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, who I think is involved in your work. It was shocking, frankly, how pervasive it was even in my home community in the Bay Area. And right. I think there's just this American myth that we have racial segregation because of choice, when in reality, this is something that was actually enforced by policy and law.
It was policy. That's right. Yep. It's this idea of de facto versus de jure. Absolutely.
So let's get back to your work in Altadena then. If Altadena came about because it was one of these communities where Black families could really own their homes, and now that's being obliterated by the fire, what are you doing to help them?
So Greenline's mission, like you said, is to close the racial wealth and home ownership gaps and reverse the effects of systemic racism in housing. And pre-wildfire, that's the space that we were operating in. And the way that we were executing our mission was really in three components. One was homeownership access, like you said, and that's down payment grants. The second is homeownership preservation for Black and Brown people, and that is specifically in the form of home maintenance grants to help people maintain and increase home values, and also in the form of access to pro bono and low bono estate planning and legal services so that we can ensure that the asset is properly protected and prepared to be passed to the next generation. And then third is financial education. So that's all. That was our work. That's what we did pre-wildfire. It only follows that post-wildfire, our mission, the way that we show up and support, would just be a continuation of our existing mission. To serve the Black and Brown homeowner population of Altadena that was affected by the fires. And specifically, we're executing that in two phases. The first phase involves helping Black and Brown homeowners who lost their home in the Eaton Fire locate, procure, and pay for long-term temporary housing in or as close to the community as possible, because what previous natural disasters have taught us, and the disproportionate impact on communities of color, is that if they leave the community, they are significantly less likely to return and rebuild. So we're trying to prevent a mass exodus of the identity that makes Altadena so special and so unique by helping to provide the stability of that long-term temporary housing. People are so overwhelmed after having lost everything, they can't even consider whether or not they want to rebuild without the stability that comes with, well, where am I going to live in the meantime? We talked to one lady earlier today and just awarded her a grant for long-term temporary housing. And since the fires, Curtis, she has lived in 15 different places.
Oh my
This
goodness.
is someone who grew up in Altadena. Her family had a home in Altadena that they left to her. And so she has never lived anywhere else. And then in the past 90 days has lived in 15 different places. That's what we're trying to mitigate, right? To avoid. We need to provide people with stability and one of the devastating, times of their life. And so that's kind of our phase one plan. We're hoping to help at least 50 families in this way, with assistance for up to $40,000 or up to 1 year. And honestly, what we're finding as a part of this effort, as we collect information from people who submit our intake form asking for assistance, is that a lot of the homes in the area and a lot of Black and brown homeowners have had their home for many, many years, which means that they might not be financially prepared all of a sudden to now pay market rent, depending on what they're getting from insurance, which oftentimes is not adequate. And so what we did to kind of mitigate that fact, the difficulty that they were finding in qualifying for rental housing, is Greenline entered into a corporate lease agreement with an apartment building in a nearby community. And that way, Greenline's assets and income will qualify people. And then we just enter into direct lease agreements with individuals. So they don't have to worry about that. And we're also subsidizing the rent as well, and above what they can maybe afford to pay, depending on their FEMA and insurance payouts. Because a lot of people are still paying a mortgage, Curtis, on a home that no longer exists. And so that's another barrier and obstacle that people are facing. So that's our kind of medium-term plan. Yep.
What's funding this work for yourself as an organization?
As a community, we're encouraged by the outpouring of support that has come. But I will say, for as much in funding as we've received from various foundations, the Pasadena Community Foundation, there have been a lot of resources pouring into various organizations. And once they hear about Greenline's work, they try to participate financially. The challenge is that the need is so great that we're expending those resources very quickly, and we need them to be re-upped, because this will be a marathon and not a sprint, right? So it's important that funders and philanthropy and capital, because this is going to require debt as well, it's important that they know that this is a phased process. It has to be iterative. For example, just last week or 2 weeks ago, we deployed over $200,000 in long-term temporary housing rental assistance just in the week for people, and got them into this apartment building, right? So we're hoping to help at least 50 families in this way. We're up to 15 with an intake form of interested families that's over 200 people long, right? And so, so the majority of the funding for this so far, taking the long route back to your question, Curtis, has come from foundations and individuals.
Yeah. Well, so tell individuals what they can do if they want to contribute to this work. They go to your website?
Yes, they can go to our website. It's our plan and our strategy for Eaton Fire relief will pop up when you go to the website, and you can click on the link to learn more, to really just determine how you want to participate, and to really get a sense for what our comprehensive and long-term plan is. Because like I said, this will be a marathon and not a sprint.
Full disclosure, my wife and I are donors to Greenline. We really believe in their mission. We actually were donors before the Altadena fire, but especially their crucial role now. We're really glad to be supporters. Jasmin, when I put myself in your shoes and think of the scope of the problem, I mean, the scope being the vastness of the fires and how horrific the destruction was, in addition to the historic injustices and legacy and barriers that you're addressing. How do you stay in this game? How do you stay motivated? How does your faith play a role in the work that you're doing?
It plays the role, Curtis, because this is so much bigger than me as an individual. This is so much bigger than Greenline as an organization. And this is even bigger than the community of Altadena as a community, right? And so honestly, what helps me to stay in this work is hearing and connecting with the people that we're helping about how what Greenline is doing is an answered prayer for them, right? It's people telling us you are the hands and feet of Jesus right now. It's people breaking down in tears when we tell them like, nope, yep, we're covering your rent for an entire year. So that burden is lifted off of you. So that's the fuel for the fire. That's the Lord's confirmation to me that what we're doing is making a difference, because quite frankly, it is hard to see. It's hard to be surrounded by so much devastation. It's hard to stare down the barrel of what it will take to rebuild this community in the long term and the significant amount of capital that it will require. And me being one person and our team being only one team and Greenline being only one organization. But the Lord and his kindness reminds me that one, he is no stranger to David's facing Goliaths. And two, this is his organization and not mine. And so really feeling the confidence that anything he has called Greenline to, he will equip us for.
Well, Jasmin, I think this is a great model for all of us in this social political moment where we look at what's happening and all the problems seem so vast and beyond our ability to deal with. And so I just think you're providing a great model for, it may be vast, but you start somewhere. You pick a spot, you pick a neighborhood. I love the fact that you guys are picking a neighborhood, especially one obviously with so much meaning as Altadena, and just planting yourself and saying, well, we'll be a signpost to the kingdom. So thank you for doing that. Jasmin, I want to ask you, how did you come to this mission? What prompted you to start this? And what were you doing before this? And how did you make the transition to this?
The short answer to that question, Curtis, is that me starting Greenline was really the culmination of a lot of lived personal and professional experience that was happening completely unbeknownst to me. So it's really a result of God's providence is what I like to say. But I'll give you kind of the abbreviated story behind it. And that's that I shared I was born on the south side of Chicago. I've always loved real estate. I've always loved houses. I used to ride my bike to open houses as a kid because I just loved what it represented, right? It's just opportunity and memories and so many different things. So I always have loved real estate. And I went to college, I studied business and learned about, financial models of wealth creation and different instruments and all of that, really learned about this idea of wealth. And then after college, I worked as a corporate credit risk underwriter, analyzing the financial statements of home builders and developers, very large home builders and developers. And one thing that struck me in that space is that no one that I was meeting with, none of the accounts that I was underwriting, none of them ever looked like me. And we're talking about significant amounts of wealth, right? And so that was something that it just kind of gave me pause. But like, as I started, going throughout my professional life, I couldn't help but notice. And then when my first daughter was born, I took a little bit of time off work, but got my real estate license and my quote unquote spare time. And when I was studying for that exam, I was struck by the fact that it wasn't until 1968 that it became illegal everywhere to discriminate on the basis of race, among other protected classes, in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. And so drawing on my background and what I know about wealth and the time it takes, I'm like, well, wait a second. If it was legal in 1967 to discriminate on the basis of race and what I know about the time it takes for wealth to be created and how crucial property ownership is as a component of that, then no wonder we see these huge gaps and disparities in homeownership and wealth that we see today. And so that kind of got my wheels turning. And then I worked, probably most importantly in this kind of genesis story of Greenline, is that I worked at my home church as the business director And so I not only learned the ins and outs of nonprofit management, but more importantly, I learned about the gospel imperative to pursue justice. I
Mm.
learned that Jesus actually cares. I learned that they're inextricably linked versus so often what happens is the temptation to separate them, right? And so that was really, really crucial. So then the catalytic moment was in 2020 with the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, when I just was so angry. I was so angry, Curtis. And I was journaling and reading scripture one day, and the Lord led me to Psalm 82 and the part where it says, defend the cause of the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and oppressed. And that just really stuck out to me. And I was like, Lord, what can I do? And he's like, just use who you are, what you have, where you're at. And that's really when I feel like the Holy Spirit planted the seeds of Greenline. And we incorporated that year.
That's a great story and so inspiring for the rest of us to just, listen to God and in this moment, think about who we are, what we have, and where we're at. Those are just great questions and to get started on that. So, Jasmin, thank you for modeling that for us. We're talking with Jasmin Shupper, who is working in LA in the wake of the devastation of the LA fires, and in particular, trying to help a community called Altadena that was historically a place where Blacks could actually buy and own homes. But that neighborhood has almost completely burnt down. And so Jasmin and her organization, Greenline, is trying to lead the way to rebuild that community. I want to step back to the bigger picture because we're in a political moment, Jasmin, where the current administration is leading a massive effort really to rewrite the history of race in America. It's doing it in a number of different ways. I won't go into the details, but basically anything that makes the claim that there is racism present is under potential attack and erasure by this administration. Can you talk more about just why real estate is so crucial to understanding the racial history and why you cannot eradicate race from it? I mean, you talked about the specific policies of redlining and racially restrictive covenants. What are other ways, or what are ways in which real estate really defines, especially the racial wealth gap over the long term? Like, why does home ownership so critical to that?
Well, home ownership has historically been, even this idea of property ownership, right, has historically been one of the biggest drivers of wealth accumulation and stability and identity, even from the very beginning. And so real estate has always been a crucial component that informs the racial wealth and home ownership gap because it's so significant of a wealth builder, right? And because of the limited access to home ownership and real estate and how intentional that was. And so I'll kind of back up without going too far back, but there are significant moments in history and policies that have culminated to create the significant disparities in home ownership and wealth that we see today. If we go back to the end of, the slavery and 40 acres and a mule, right? It was fundamentally understood that in order for the newly freed population to have any chance at economic independence, property ownership, land ownership was a crucial component of it. And so in one of the biggest corrective policies ever instituted, 40 acres and a mule, which gave 400,000 acres of land to 40,000 freed slaves, was instituted and conceived. And unfortunately, when Lincoln died and Andrew Johnson became president, the order was overturned and all of the land was returned to the Confederate landowners. And it's estimated, based on some economic analysis that's been done, that the value of that land is somewhere near $6 billion. And so that's just one. That's one significant policy, right? That was motivated by discrimination and racism that had significant and far-reaching generational economic implications. That's one. And then you go to the Great Migration, right? After federal protection ended in the South, and you had this mass exodus of Black people leaving the South in search of an opportunity to thrive and live. They fled to different places. That's when you started to see the emergence of zoning laws that were intentionally created to segregate neighborhoods and prevent the newly migrating Black population from living in white communities and white suburbs. The first zoning law was enacted actually in the Bay Area. And it was done very intentionally. This was a policy, right, that was intended to perpetuate racism and segregation. And fast forward, you can, go through a number of different ones, and not the least of which is the FHA. After the New Deal, after the Depression, and all these New Deal era initiatives started to take shape, which were theoretically really good and ways to spur the economy. When you have racist people in power, racism is perpetuated, right? And so, and I want to be clear, and I say this often, but I'm not talking about white people being bad. I love white people. As a follower of Jesus, I love all people. We are called to. What is evil is a system that was created to exclude and oppress and perpetuate racism. The wickedness is the system. It is not the people. And so I just want to make that clear as I'm talking about all of these significant legislations and these things that have culminated to create such wide disparities. And so when the FHA, the FHA was created to encourage lenders to make loans so that more people could access home ownership. And it basically said, no, we'll insure you in case, so-and-so defaults on their loan, we will step in and we'll make sure that you're made whole, right? And so this was a really groundbreaking piece of legislation. In the almost 30-year period between 1964 in 1932, there was $120 billion of government-backed mortgages given out at a time when homeownership was arguably the most accessible. Less than 2% of that $120 billion went to non-white people. That is significant. That has a significant implication that is lasting and far-reaching and informs wealth and communities and families and access to so many of the social determinants of well-being that are tied to place, right? And so, lest anybody see this as being something that's happening in silos, like you said, housing and access to housing and stability informs so many other areas of life.
Talk about the generational aspect of it, because I think that's what's so crucial about housing is how it is passed on from one generation to another, and it increases in value and wealth. And it's kind of what gives stability to communities across generations. Can you explain that dynamic, which also explains why the Altadena fires is erasing not just the community that's present there, but in some ways the communities that are to come.
That's right. Legacies. And that's what we're telling people. These aren't just homes, these are legacies. Because for so many people in Altadena, their home was where the majority of their wealth was, as is so often the case because of, like you said, the wealth building that homeownership affords. So it's really generational. And an example of that, I am a living example of that, actually, and not in just as far as what can happen with generational property ownership. And I am an exception as a Black woman in the United States and not a rule to this. But I was born on the south side of Chicago, and I was born into a home that my paternal grandmother owned that miraculously, as a single Black woman in the 60s, she was able to purchase. But because of redlining and racially restrictive covenants, she was relegated to only being able to purchase in a certain area of the city. And that was the south side of Chicago, which since has had a lot of disinvestment. But nevertheless, she was able to purchase that home. She left that home to my dad when she died. And then I was born into that home. And then the assets from the sale of that home is what fueled all future purchases for my family that afforded me things like access to quality education and adequate health care and so many social determinants of well-being that are tied to place, right? And again, this is not, I am not a wealthy person, right? But I benefited from a purchase that my grandmother made before I was even born that affected my life and my schooling and my education in significant ways. That is the benefit of generational property ownership. An example of that too, even statistically, we can see that our white brothers and sisters who are first-time homeowners, home buyers, they get financial assistance for the down payment from a family member almost 50% of the time, compared to our Black brothers and sisters who get that assistance 10% of the time. That is what we're talking about. And so that's why, the credit implications, because you have to borrow more. That's why, Black and brown people were disproportionately impacted by the subprime mortgage crisis, because they had less cushion in their homes, less equity, because they are statistically more likely to have to take advantage of low down payment or no down payment loans and mortgage products. And so it's all tied together. And this generational wealth through home building, when you're able to pass down an asset, significantly affects families and schools. We have so many people on our list, on our intake form list, who had generational homes that were either inherited. And because of that, people were able to work and live in Pasadena, which is an area that is now very hard to access if you have not been here for many years, right? But they're able to be here because of a choice that their parent or grandparent made before they were born. That is generational legacy. That's generational wealth.
I think this is the thing that American culture, and in particular American majority culture, I think has such a hard time grasping, because we live with such the myth of the individual
That's right.
and meritocracy, right? So I am where I am because of my own individual efforts. And if we really deconstruct that narrative, for at least for many of us, they tell the story similar to what you just described, that there was some family assistance or family wealth that got passed on, that was a key boost at a key point in their life. And it's sobering to think about that family wealth being rooted in real estate and property ownership, that in turn was buttressed by racist policies and practices. So that's a narrative that's just not very well understood or told, right, Jasmin?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought it up, Curtis, because there is a tendency, like you said, to think that these things operate in silos, or to think that, people just need to work harder. And if they work harder, unfortunately for Black people, Black and brown people, but more pervasively for Black people, hard work was not a prerequisite for success. Whereas for other populations, it was, if that makes sense. My grandpa could go into a bank and try to apply for a loan, but my husband's grandpa, who's Caucasian, could go into a bank and apply for a loan and be assured that he would only be evaluated on his creditworthiness. My grandpa couldn't say the same, right?
Yeah.
That these are the things that inform the disparities that we see today, and the segregation that we see today, and even the disproportionate impact, if you boil it down to, very, very locally and very, very specifically, what informs the disparities that we see in Altadena right now.
Jasmin, when you try to make this case about systematic racism, really, which is what you're trying to do here as applied to real estate, when you do this in Christian circles, what do you encounter?
Oh, that's a great question, Curtis. It varies. I think that there's a sense, unfortunately, the idea of equity has been so highly politicized that it's lost its humanity, right? It's lost the human touch. And as people of faith, it's lost the imago Dei, right? Of that we're actually talking about real people. So sometimes what we encounter in this space is discomfort from the standpoint of we're politicizing things, right? We're being political, and politics has no place in Christian spaces, right? So that's one thing. Another thing is, the perception that we're somehow demonizing white people, which is the last thing we're doing. Again, I'm married to a white person. I love white people, right? Like that we're attacking the system. We're attacking oppression. We're not attacking, white people by calling out ways that they've benefited from an unjust system. That's not calling them out, right? So I think that there's some level of discomfort there that sometimes exists in Christian spaces. And there's also a sense of God loves everybody, Jesus, loves everybody. Why are we singling out certain demographics for help, right? Or for assistance when Jesus loves everybody? How is that fair? And to that, I would say, Jesus actually hated unjust systems, and he got really, really angry with oppression. And so we're acting in a restorative and reparative and redemptive way that Jesus would have wanted to happen, because the church has an opportunity to redeem the evils of systematic racism and systemic oppression. And so it's really diving into conversations and approaching it from that standpoint that helps in those Christian spaces. And honestly, there are some Christian spaces that are like, no, yes, what you're doing is absolutely necessary, and we need to do it. I mean, our first seed funding for launching Greenline was from a church. And so there are churches that are willing and able and present for the conversation. And I think that it will require bravery and boldness on the part of believers if this issue is ever to be adequately tackled.
Oh, amen to that. Jasmin, so we've been talking about the vastness and the deep history of systemic racism and your efforts to combat it. And I remember you saying that, in the vastness of it, it's the stories that keep you going, the stories that tell you that the Lord is at work through you. Can you share some of those stories? Like, what are the stories of people who have kind of changed the direction of their lives precisely because of the work of Greenline?
There, for example, was a homeowner couple that has worked hard and done everything right. And they went to school and they went to college and they did all of these things, but they didn't have that generational wealth or that backup to ask for a down payment. And so they were finding, why aren't we able to, be competitive? They had saved, they had, done everything right. They had a reasonable down payment that they had saved, but just kept getting outbid. And Greenline stepped in, gave them a grant, and now they're proud homeowners. And he is an educator in South LA, and she is working on policy change to improve the experience of Black and brown children in public schools in California. And so because of the Greenline grant, they were able to stay in the community where they work and serve, and they would not have been able to otherwise. And so that's one example of a story where Greenline was really the catalyst for them being able to access something that now sets them on a trajectory that hopefully will change their life and the lives of their children for multiple generations. There was another woman who would be considered, low income, because we help all income levels at Greenline, because we're trying to close the racial wealth gap, which is a lot wider than income gaps and takes time to accumulate. Income itself is not a disqualifier for our program. And so we were helping a woman a single mom, who had, again, saved and worked and done everything right, but she needed, I think she was $14,000 short to close. And she could make the monthly payments. She, had good credit. She had saved. She had done everything right. Again, Greenline stepped in with that $14,000, and she was beside herself with tears because she was like, I just needed a little bit of help to access this. And so that's one.
That's so motivating to hear about the sort of a leverage you can have by giving people just a little bit of help at the exact right moment.
That's right.
That seems to be like a critical part of your mission. Real quick, what's next? Or I guess what's next is that you're continuing to work in the LA fires. Do you think that will just be the focus of the organization?
So our ongoing mission continues. We're still doing down payment grants. We're still doing home maintenance grants. We're still doing financial education. So our ongoing mission continues. We are also showing up specifically in the form of Eaton support. So earlier I shared kind of our medium-term phase 1 plan with the long-term temporary housing and rental assistance subsidies for Black and brown homeowners who lost their homes in the fire. But we also have a whole long-term phase that has 2 components. One is recognizing that our target demographic is likely to be underinsured or worse, have no insurance, and that there will be significant gaps in the actual cost of rebuilding the structure in and above what insurance or FEMA will cover. And Greenline is hoping to offer up to $250,000 per family in financial assistance for the cost of rebuilding the actual dwelling, right? That's the construction of that. And then the second component of our long-term plan is one that kind of happened organically, and that is we have been approached as a trusted organization in the community that is prioritizing Black and Brown homeownership preservation and wealth restoration, we have been asked to purchase lots from people who maybe don't want to rebuild. We're trying to convince everyone to rebuild and connect them with the resources so that people can rebuild, restore, and remain. But for people who don't want to rebuild, we have been asked to purchase those lots in this kind of land banking initiative, hold them in trust, and then work with community stakeholders and housing stakeholders and policy experts about what the future use of that land will be in a way that's community informed and community centered. And so we actually closed escrow on our first lot purchase a couple weeks ago and have been approached by several other sellers who don't want to rebuild, but want to preserve the neighborhood and maintain the fabric of the neighborhood. And so that's one component of our long-term plan. We have no interest in becoming, long-term developers, right? But what we will do with any lots that we purchase will be consistent with our normal mission of closing the racial wealth and homeownership gaps and facilitating access to homeownership, right? And so we're going to be busy. We're going to be busy because we're also going to continue, like I said, our normal course of operations. So there's capacity building that we're doing as an organization to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to scale these relief efforts and really be present for the long haul. Because like I said, it will be a marathon and not a sprint.
Well, Jasmin, we're really glad you're running that marathon. You're an inspiration to us. Thank you. And if you are a listener and you remember seeing those devastating images of the fires and you want to invest in the rebuilding of those communities, I encourage you to check out the work of Greenline Housing Foundation. We'll put a link to that organization in the show notes, and also learn more about the historic reasons for their work by reading a book such as The Color of Law. And we'll put other links to other resources as well. Jasmin, thank you so much for joining us on the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Curtis, and for just highlighting the work and the work of so many others. It's really inspiring.
All right. And listeners, we want to encourage you to once again join us. And I'm almost kind of hesitant to use our standard imagery, but join us around the campfire as we gather and talk about the many issues in the world.